Thanks for being here. You'll notice there's a different title. We're sort of playing around. We're in the midst, knee deep of figuring things out. This may or may not be the final title, but basically the gist is that we're here today to give you just an introduction to this next iteration of BioMap. I'm going to start off the conversation and then hand it over to Andy, and then I'll be closing it up again. And we have James with us today to help with answering some questions and so forth. So let's set the scene. We pretty much all are aware of our biodiversity crisis, that our biodiversity is in crisis, both at the global, the national, and the state scale. According to a National Wildlife Federation 2018 report, 1/3 of the species in the US are vulnerable, and 1 in 5 species is at high risk of extinction. There's currently over 1,600 species listed on the Federal Endangered Species Act, and over 12,000 species have been identified within the US in the various state wildlife action plans. In Massachusetts, we currently have 432 species that are listed on the Massachusetts Endangered Species List. This also includes some of the federally listed species. The major concerns or threats that we're seeing are things like habitat loss and fragmentation, as well as invasive species and other stressors, which are all compounded by climate change. The recent UN climate report that was released recognizes the interdependence of climate, ecosystems, and biodiversity and human societies. And so with that, urgent action really is needed if we want to reverse these trends. So we see BioMap as a call to action. There's a long history of Massachusetts being a leader in this effort, with BioMap in 2001, Living Waters in 2003, and BioMap3 in 2010. So now we're working on the next iteration of BioMap. We're actually moving away from calling it BioMap3. We really see this as an ongoing effort that will need to be updated more frequently. And so all of these tools really have been groundbreaking in terms of conservation within the Commonwealth, and they really provide a framework for protection and stewardship of the lands and waters that are critical for biodiversity conservation. This information that's been brought together in these different tools over the years has become heavily utilized because it really is a trusted, credible source of information. And we really think that this next iteration of BioMap and moving forward is going to be able to promote and catalyze partnerships and allow multiple organizations to coordinate their efforts in terms of biodiversity conservation in the Commonwealth. So why are we looking at this next iteration of BioMap? The data at this point are over, it's almost probably 12 years old now. And so we're looking to update information as well as integrating new data from multiple sources. We want to continue to build on this legacy and guide the future conservation and planning and landscape protection efforts in Massachusetts. And we really think that this will help facilitate larger landscape scale thinking for conservation actions. And we need to think big. This is, a matter of developing a shared vision so that we can tackle these threats and hopefully work towards conserving biodiversity in Massachusetts. So what's new? We're here today to give you a sneak peek behind the curtain, as they say. I already mentioned that we're going to be incorporating updated information on our native biodiversity and habitats within the Commonwealth. We also, with this next iteration, are going to be presenting the data at multiple scales. We're looking to address climate change threats with the information, as well as provide recommendations on habitat management and restoration opportunities. And then finally, it's really going to utilize a state-of-the-art interactive web interface and GIS hub, which I will say we're in the midst of working on right now furiously to meet our deadline for release, which ideally will be early summer. So just as a reminder of the BioMap3 components, all of these are going to be carried over into the next iteration, but enhanced. And as a reminder, core habitat identifies the areas that are critical for conservation for the long-term persistence of rare and species of conservation concern, as well as a wide diversity of natural communities and intact ecosystems. And you can see the several components make up this core habitat. Critical natural landscapes identify large landscape blocks that provide habitat for wide-ranging native species. They support intact ecological processes, maintain connectivity among habitats, and enhance ecological resilience. And this also includes upland areas that support both the aquatic cores and the wetland cores. And all of these, as I said, are going to be carried over and enhanced. So for today's discussion, we're going to talk through some of the components, and that includes how we're looking at things at multiple scales and how we'll be presenting the information, an update to how we're identifying the aquatic cores, how we're incorporating climate resilience data into the components. Then we're also going to move on to show a new piece that we're working on habitat management and restoration. I'm going to walk through quickly what the products are that you can expect that are going to come out of this effort, how BioMap can be applied, and then looking towards the future. And we're going to have a couple of different points where we're going to stop and allow for questions. So looking at the components, this is one example of one of the components that make up core habitat, the species information. As you may or may not recall, in BioMap3, this information was presented statewide with eco-regional representation. One of the things that we had heard as a feedback or critique from BioMap3 was that people wanted information not just at the state or regional level, but also for their area or municipality or local level. So we worked hard to bring this with this next iteration. So in this biomap, we're, for example, with this layer of species information, going to be presenting the most important areas for species at what we're right now terming the global scale. That might change, but this is looking beyond the boundaries of Massachusetts. Where are the important areas for our species of concern? We're also, similar to BioMap3, going to continue to present the information at a statewide scale so that these priority areas are identified. And then another new piece is that, which is represented by the orange here, is that we're going to be zooming in and looking at the important areas within the boundaries of all the municipalities in Massachusetts. And that effort is going to be done for several of our components. Another significant change is an update to how aquatic core is developed. You can see from this slide here that there's a lot of data that are going to be incorporated into developing aquatic core. And there's new metrics that are going to be used to include some of the common species as well as the rare species. For aquatic core, you'll remember that in BioMap3, the information was presented statewide by major basin, and that in this biomap, we're still going to be presenting data that way, but we're also going to be providing information at that local scale. And this is going to be done for both stream and pond and lake systems. And so another way that the biomap aquatic core components are going to be created is that, we take all the information, all the various data points that I just listed. And for each point, we, which is, from multiple data sources, we're going to extend at least 2,000 meters above and below to capture the entire life cycle of the fish or the invertebrate species, et cetera. And then we take a look and see if there are any barriers. For example, here with this red block, we're looking at a dam that would be a barrier to movement. We would excise out the section impacted by the dam. And then through a then these areas that are left over or remaining are buffered by 300 meters for the core, which includes floodplains. And then with the help of a new tool that was developed with UMass, we are buffering into the surrounding undeveloped landscape to identify areas to protect functions critical to the resource. We're also incorporating resiliency into this information. We've identified areas that are resilient to increases in water temperatures using models developed by USGS. And so now I'm actually going to turn it over to Andy so that he can walk through the next few slides.
Great. Thank you, Eve. Thanks everyone for joining this morning, and thanks Abby for hosting. As Eve mentioned, like in BioMap3, we're building ecosystem and landscape scale habitat features into BioMap. And these are designed to capture the full breadth of the state's biodiversity, both now and into the future. And these include wetland cores, forest cores, landscape blocks, and a new component of regional connectivity that we did not have in BioMap3. Next slide, Eve. For all these elements, we're using landscape scale analysis data. So I'm going to give you one example, which is forest cores. We've delineated forest interior habitat, which is really important especially for forest interior bird species. And we call this interior habitat forest cores, just as we did in BioMap3. And these forests are embedded in and buffered by much larger landscapes. And to create these, as we did 12 years ago, we're using the UMass CAPS Index of Ecological Integrity to help us delineate the least fragmented, most intact, well-buffered forests in Massachusetts. And then we use a variable size threshold across Massachusetts, realizing that the size of a forest core in the Boston area is different than the size in the Berkshires or Taconics. And up to this point, it's a very similar analysis to BioMap3 with updated land use data and a new Index of Ecological Integrity from UMass. Next slide, Eve. But we wanted to very deliberately and directly incorporate climate resilience into BioMap. So to make sure the habitats stand the test of time, support plants and wildlife into the future in the context of climate change, and to ensure that our conservation investments are going to stand the test of time and pay off over the long run, we incorporated the Nature Conservancy's resilience analysis into the biomap. So into the components I'm discussing now, the forest core, the wetland core, the landscape blocks, and the regional connectivity. So in a super quick nutshell, the areas in green on this map are the areas that are more resilient for species in the context of climate change. They are places that provide options to species. The green areas are those that have more microclimates and more connectivity among them, which allows plants and animals to move to more suitable habitat during climate extremes and under the impacts of long-term change. The data in the center map is downscaled to Massachusetts. We did that for the biomap because biomap's a Massachusetts product. But you should know that while piloting the data in the Northeast, the Nature Conservancy has now expanded this analysis across the continental US. Next slide, please, Eve. So jumping back to this is the same slide. So this is the forest core set based on that index of ecological integrity. And then if we move to the next slide, what we did was we wanted to maximize the amount of this resilience in the forest cores. So the orange forest cores added to this full set now maximize that resilience. These are cores added to the full set based on their high resilience, based on the TNC analysis. Next slide, please, Steve. So we're doing something very similar with landscape blocks. These are large areas of intact, well-connected lands, rivers, forests, water, wetlands, as well as pastures, shrublands, and in some cases, even very low density development dispersed among natural lands. Next slide. So we're building landscape blocks very similarly to as we did in BioMap3 using the index of ecological integrity. But we're using, of course, a new IEI, index of ecological integrity, and new land use data. And it's a good time to pause and just say what we're trying to do is have continuity between BioMap2 and BioMap3. So everyone using these are not starting from scratch. It's not a whole new paradigm, but we want to build all the enhancements, innovations, new data into the new biomap so that we can take advantage of these concepts and data. So there will be some similarities, but some modest enhancements as well. And one thing we're looking for is places that have been developed in the intervening 12 years since BioMap2 was released in 2010. So if you hit the next slide, Eve, the previous slide was from a 2008 image. This 2021 image shows that a large solar array has been built in what was the BioMap2 landscape block. And if you hit one click, Eve, what we'll do for BioMap2, in addition to using our newest and latest data, is we'll make sure to excise developed areas. And it's a reminder both that we need to update the data as the reality on the ground changes. And also I find it a good reminder of the imperative of our collective conservation efforts to conserve the footprint of biomap as it's facing threats of all sorts of development, not just solar, but we see similar encroachments on the BioMap2 footprint from residential development and other forms of development. Next slide, please, Eve. And just we're now at the fire hose stage level of data that we're throwing at you, but a couple more slides. The wetland core data is also very similar approach to BioMap2. In this map of wetland cores, the blue are those identified using the UMass Index of Ecological Integrity, but the orange were identified using the Nature Conservancy's resilience analysis, again, providing options to species under a changing climate. And of course, this is a simplified view. There are many, and really most of the wetlands hit both of these features, the Index of Ecological Integrity and TNC's resilience measures. Next slide, please, Eve. As Eve mentioned, we're looking at data at multiple scales, and everything I've presented so far has been from a statewide perspective. We also have analogs for some of these data at both the global and the local scales. And from a global perspective, we're adding a regional connectivity component. And these are places that support the range shifts of species over time, over multiple generations, and at continental scales. The scale of movement is at the subcontinental scale. And the reason I have a picture of a tulip tree flower in leaves is because tulip tree is an example of one of the tree species that's anticipated to shift its range northward as the climate changes. And then finally, I'll wrap up with the next slide. From a local perspective, we realize that not every city and town in the Commonwealth will have these large landscape blocks in blue and forest cores in green on this map, as well as wetland cores that are important from a statewide perspective. So next slide, please, Eve. So we want to make sure that every town has the perspective, both from statewide and what's important for conservation from that local perspective. So what you're seeing in that beige yellow color is a new feature we're calling local landscapes. And this is basically an analog to the large landscape blocks, but customized, developed uniquely for each of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. So that each town has a set of data from both from global, statewide, and local perspectives that they can use for conservation planning and action. And next slide, please, Eve. So we've just thrown a ton of information at you, and we have more. Eve is going to wrap us up with understanding the habitat restoration and management component. We're going to talk about the products of BioMap and next steps. But before we do that, we're going to take a quick break and just see if people have questions thus far. And Abby, I guess I'll let you moderate those as they come in, and we're ready to field your questions.
Great, thank you, Andy. So folks, if you want to just raise your hand, then I will ask you to unmute if you have a question.
And there's
right,
there's one in the chat too.
Okay, great. We have Rita. I've asked you to unmute.
Yes, I'm so excited about BioMap3. I can hardly wait. I have a question. I know that historically wetlands have been pretty well established for protection. However, seeing wetlands as the bedroom, we know the living room and the kitchen and everything else is the upland. And will the value of upland as habitat for everything that breeds in vernal pools and wetlands be acknowledged in BioMap3?
I'm thinking, James, I mean, we're all happy to answer that, but James has been really working on that component. James, is it fair to throw that one at you?
Yeah, I can start. I guess I would say, for starters, that many of the components are already focusing on a lot of the upland habitat. The wetland core is focusing on the wetland habitat, but we're moving into the upland in a few different ways. One, many of the components are focusing on upland habitat. Landscape blocks, for instance, are focusing on both aquatic, the aquatic realm as well as the upland realm. But the buffer tool that we're using to buffer wetlands and the aquatic core, it's specifically designed to try to find and go after the wetland or the upland that lies directly adjacent to every single wetland core and every single aquatic core. So those are just a couple of ways that we are specifically going after and trying to identify the upland habitats that exist directly adjacent to some of the aquatic and wetland components. But Andy or Eve, do you have anything else to add?
Just that the buffer, the buffers around wetlands and aquatic systems that James is developing with input from us and from the aquatics fisheries folks at Mass Wildlife and with the data support from UMass, the CAPS team, is really sophisticated and really is designed to capture those areas that most directly influence and support those wetland functions. So I'm really excited by the amount of thought and the sophistication of the data that's going into addressing what you asked, Rita, if we got your question right.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, Laura, who asked a question in the chat, also has her hand raised. So I'm going to go ahead.
Yeah, it's really just that question. I wasn't sure you'd seen it, but first of all, this is looking great. But I was curious to know what is happening at that local level. What's different from the state level analyses? What is in the local level analyses?
I can start that and let then maybe James get into some of the detail. So we wanted to, in BioMap2, it was the strong focus was obviously on statewide priorities. And so, there were several municipalities that didn't have some components of BioMap. You can imagine more developed areas, things like that. We wanted to take a step back and look at the local level and see if we could identify areas that whether it's because of species information or these landscape blocks or whatever component would be a priority within the boundaries of that municipality potentially, but not rise to the same level of importance when you're looking at things statewide. And so there were different thresholds that we used for the different components. The data at the local level are not meant to be applied at if you're doing something at a sort of statewide planning level or at a more sort of eco-regional level.
Right.
And they'll be you know, and I'll get through what some of the tools are in a minute, they'll be displayed in that way so that people can understand the difference in how the data were compiled and what the appropriate application is for that information. So James, I don't know if you want to jump in with an example or flesh that out a little bit more.
Yeah, if you could just stop sharing the PowerPoint for a sec, I can walk through a few municipal examples. So let's see. So what I have here is the current draft of the BioMap3 state components, just to demonstrate some of the differences between the state level treatment and then the local treatment. And I think the best way to do that is to zoom in. So I'll just bounce around to a few example towns. This is Carlisle and the surrounding towns. And so you can see there are a variety of different things. What we're looking at right now is kind of the state level draft version of BioMap. We've got the wetland cores that are in pink. Priority natural communities are showing up in red. Aquatic core, let me bring this up to the top, is showing up in blue. The forest cores are shown in green. The species of conservation concern layer is purple, and the landscape blocks are peeking through in a couple places in orange. So, I mean, this is kind of what happens as you move farther towards the east, that some of the density of the BioMap layers begins to kind of wane a little bit when you're looking at it from a statewide perspective. And so the thing that we did was essentially come down to the local level, and it gives us the ability to turn things on that are important at the local level that might not be a priority statewide. And so you can see that as you zoom into Carlisle, these are the local resources that we want you to focus on potentially at a municipal perspective. It's really important to realize that these local layers, it's not appropriate to use these local layers all together at the statewide level, because it really does begin to identify too much land. But you can see here, and just reveal the changes. I'll just turn them on and off. The changes that you're seeing, the orange, smaller polygons, are the local landscapes that we've identified. And what we tried to do was go after the intact habitat that exists at the municipal level and then buffer it out a little bit. So that's why those orange, all the local landscapes kind of look like that. And then the other thing, if you'll notice, just look at the purples. You can see that some of the additional species habitat that is important but wasn't high enough ranking at the state level is now being turned on at the local level. And so you'll see that there's some additional purple that is showing. So I'm just going to bounce around to a few other examples.
While you do that, James, Lee put a comment or a question in that is related, so I'm just going to answer that. He's asking, whether a town or, would ideally focus on statewide priorities first, but then could also focus on local priorities. So it's a good question, Lee. I guess it depends on what the purpose is. We wanted to, obviously statewide priorities are going to be high ranking and important, but we often know that sometimes, for example, if resources are made available, they have limitations as to how they can be potentially utilized. And so we wanted to arm towns with more information so that they could make informed decisions. The local information will include the statewide priorities. So they will be in there. They're just showing additional areas that are important within the boundaries of that municipality, and everything at the local level's been essentially stratified to those municipal boundaries.
Yeah, and as Eve was answering that question, I just continued to bounce around. I went to Norton, up to Georgetown. Now we're on the Cape in Falmouth. So you can see how this is the statewide perspective, and then this turns on some additional targets or priorities when you come down to the municipal level. It's going to behave differently in different parts of the state. I think the local emphasis is really going to be a strong addition, especially in eastern Massachusetts, where some of the footprints have been historically a little bit weak from a statewide perspective, but turning on the local layers will kind of enrich the targets that people can take a look at.
Another question about kind of this specific difference on the local areas from Greg. Would criteria for inclusion in a local level vary by municipality? That's a question in the chat.
There it is. It's going to be a little bit, it's not, so for instance, the local landscapes, what we did, we rescaled the index of ecological integrity within the boundaries of every town. So in that respect, yes, it's a specific rescaling within the boundary of every town. And so, in a city like Worcester that has not as much natural and open land, some of those things from a statewide perspective probably would have scored quite low. But what we're doing is we're looking within the bounds of Worcester and forcing all of those areas to rescale themselves between 0 and 1. And then you can go after those areas that are most important in Worcester. And we did that in Lincoln, in Concord, in Pittsfield, like we did that for every single town. So in that way, yes, the local landscapes are going to be using specific information for every single town. But we're applying the same logic. Like, we're going to the top 20% in every town. We're looking for the areas that are greater than 10 acres. And then we apply the buffer tool to them and to expand those areas so that they're a little bit more of a target. So we're applying the same methodology to every single town. In the same way we did the same thing with the local wetland cores, same thresholding. The local aquatic cores, we're applying, again, the similar thresholds. But those things kind of manifest differently in every single town. So it's kind of both. Yeah.
Okay, we have a couple questions on data collection from Margaret. Can you say more about how the data is collected and who collects it? Is it entirely done by satellite imagery? I'm especially wondering about the local information. And then Anne goes on to say, I second the question about the sources of data. Perhaps some areas are understudied.
Yeah, so it's a good question. It depends on which layer you're looking at. So, for example, the rare species information, that's based off of the data that the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program has in their database that, is pretty extensive and well vetted. And so, you know, that is the information that's being fed into that layer. And in terms of how it plays out in the local layers for the species information, it's still the same data. It's just that a different threshold was applied to be included in the local level. So if an area is identified as important habitat for a rare species within, you know, a certain town, but not at the statewide level, it's a priority within that town, but it's not, you know, the priority for that species at a statewide level. There may be other areas that rise to higher priority when you're looking at the statewide level. In terms of the aquatic layers, you know, I put up that slide of all the information that's gone into that. That's been significantly expanded since BioMap3. You know, just we have such a rich data source now that we didn't have back then. And then as James was just talking about, the other layers were done the same way at the local level in terms of using IEI and doing that sort of same methodology, but scaled differently. So to get at, well, maybe things are understudied. That's always going to be an issue. You know, the data are as good as they are. And we always encourage collection of more information, and that actually gets at why we're so excited about this biomap release, is because it really, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, it really is a living project. We want to be updating these layers more frequently than, you know, 12 years, having new data be fed in, new analyses, things like that. So Andy and James, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I just want to, that's great, Eve. The one thing I'll add is that we really want BioMap to be a comprehensive representation of the full suite of biodiversity in Massachusetts. So we're using a variety of data. The natural heritage data and the fisheries data that Eve mentioned, these are decades long field data collection, really top of the line from a national perspective in terms of the quality and robustness of the data sets. And we're complementing that with these models that use satellite imagery. There's pros and cons to all data. One of the pros to satellite data is that it is wall to wall. We know everything, we can see every nook and cranny in the state, but it's limited in what we can understand about that every pixel or every point on the ground. But it tells us things about the patterns across Massachusetts. So I think one of the power of BioMap is that we integrate these different data sets and spend a lot of time thinking about what they mean and interpreting them to come up with that final biomap footprint. So we never claim that it's perfect, but it's a really robust representation of the important places for plants and wildlife in Massachusetts.
So I'm going to suggest that we continue, and then we have time for more questions. And we actually have some questions for you at the end. So hopefully we can have more discussion in a minute. So I'm going to go back to sharing and see. So did that work? Are we still on that slide? You guys can see it? Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to move on to this next piece, which is new with this iteration of BioMap. You know, we obviously recognize the critical importance of land protection. And, you know, there's a huge effort across the Commonwealth by many of you also to protect as much land as possible. But land protection really needs to be complemented by habitat management and in some cases restoration to be able to fully protect the biodiversity of the Commonwealth. There's a lot of species that actually require active management. And so stewardship actions are pretty critical for habitat resilience, restoring ecological processes, preparing for, or in some cases, recovering from and adapting to climate change. And so we really wanted to be able to address this with BioMap. And so we're working to provide a set of online tools to help users locate, prioritize, develop and implement management and restoration activities focused on more nature-based solutions. Our hope is that these efforts, or what we're working to do, are going to complement ongoing projects that we're doing at the state and regional level. And this really is going to be a resource type clearinghouse where there'll be a lot of information, as well as the ability to continue to add information over time. And I promised I would talk about what some of the products are that you can expect. So the big thing is that this is going to be a really interactive web interface. It's going to include, the web map that will allow you to investigate the data, things like story maps that will walk you through some of the information and background and how to use the data. There's going to be ability to download the data, and then there's also going to be this habitat management and restoration piece that I was just talking about. We're not going totally digital. We're also going to continue to have a summary or glossy type report and a pamphlet, as well as there will be a more detailed technical report that will obviously go into the nitty-gritty of how BioMap was put together and what the various details are in creation of the layers and so forth. This is not what it's going to look like in the end. In fact, it's changed since we did this. But the idea is that it's really going to be a type of a GIS hub. We're really knee deep on this right now, and so a lot is in flux. But again, you're going to have basic information on BioMap, how to use it, be able to access the various components, have some basic information on core and critical natural landscapes, as well as more detail when you want to dive down into the subcomponents like the species information and the aquatic resources. The interactive map, we're building a great tool that's going to allow you to get some summary information for your area of interest, upload your own shape files to be able to get that summary information based on whatever boundaries you've put up into the map. And you'll also be able to, as I said, download the data and be able to manipulate it yourself with it if you have GIS capabilities. And then this will also link out to the various resources like the habitat management piece, as well as any documentation that I was talking about. So moving on to some of the applications, I'm sure many of you have experience with BioMap3. So this, next iteration of BioMap, the applications are similar. It really is trying to help with prioritization of conservation efforts at the local, the regional, within the statewide scale, and things like identifying priorities for land protection, working towards planning, for example, development of open space plans. It can help with, I think, supporting or, providing guidance for where there may be the need for some regulatory efforts like bylaws, for example. Andy showed that solar example, so I know some towns are working or struggling with solar siting. working again towards aquatic resource protection, getting at that question we had earlier, identifying some of the supporting landscapes for those resources, as well as providing information for some grant applications. I know many of you apply for things like the land grants or the landscape partnership and conservation partnership grants. And then also finally that habitat management and restoration piece. We really are excited to present that information to you all. And I think, Andy, you were going to take this.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. BioMap is definitely designed to identify places that conserve biodiversity, but it's very important to remind ourselves and everybody that the lands and waters identified in BioMap are also critical to provide us with a full range of benefits. And I know there's another session in the conference about ecosystem benefits, but not limited to, but clean drinking water, recreation opportunities, flood and drought mitigation, and the sequestration of carbon. The places that BioMap identifies are all important to these functions. And eventually, some sooner than later, we may try to quantify some of these ecosystem benefits from the BioMap footprint. So I'm just sticking my nose in just for this slide to remind us of these benefits to the millions of people that reside in Massachusetts as well, in addition to wildlife and plants.
Yep. And also trying to think forward with this effort. As I said, we really see this as a living project. We're hopeful that it's going to lead to facilitation of collaboration more so than that's already been happening. There's some great efforts out there, and this can be used to enhance those and hopefully develop some new partnerships, increasing outreach opportunities, getting this information out to a broader audience, maybe some constituencies that typically don't interact with this type of information, really making it relevant to all communities and helping people use BioMap. One of the things we're looking at is how BioMap will potentially overlap with some of the environmental justice communities that have been identified in the Commonwealth. And then, as Andy was saying, there's really opportunities for additional data and analyses moving forward, looking at things like carbon sequestration, how it overlays potentially with drinking water supplies and so forth. And then finally, taking a step back with some of the new things that we've been looking at, for example, regional connectivity and so forth. There's a lot of information that we have that we hope can inform regional conservation efforts. A lot of these efforts don't stay to the boundaries that are developed, from a municipal perspective or a state perspective. Habitats cross political boundaries. So this really can be a case study for a more regional and national application. And so finally, if successfully conserved, the vision that we hope we've laid out here with BioMap will allow the full complement of Massachusetts plants, animals, and habitats to survive and thrive. And we hope that this will be side by side with a thriving population of Massachusetts residents that have ample access to nature and outdoor recreation, while also trying to ensure a climate resilient landscape that protects our rich natural heritage for now and for future generations. So with that, I think we're gonna take some additional questions, and then we actually wanted to follow up with some potential questions for you for feedback for us. So I don't know if we want to start with some questions on that last bit from people.
Again, feel free to raise your hands or put the questions in the chat. I actually have a question while we're waiting. Speaking of prioritizing lands for conservation and doing that kind of an evaluation, where you've incorporated the CAPS data and the TNC resiliency data, do you have a vision yet as to when folks are using these data sets, how they would combine those data or not? If there's a potential redundancy there when evaluating land, with all the various data sets that are available?
I'll jump in. we're trying to maximize the inclusion of those high ecological integrity and the high resilient areas in BioMap. So we do want BioMap to be a standalone product that maximizes those features and those concepts. That being said, for fine scale analysis, it's not 100%. And so those data, the UMass CAPS, IEI, and the TNC resilience are still value added, but we think that BioMap now, including those features, has a standalone function that maximizes those resilience. So it's quite a squishy answer. That's a pretty squirrely answer, but the footprint, we've interpreted those data with other data to try to identify places that have all these features. And so it kind of consolidates and focuses. And yet there's still, if you're looking at your backyard, it may not be in BioMap, but it may be, you can get information from the other data sources that may or may not be in BioMap. Is that helpful, Abby?
Yeah, and I'll just email you
Okay.
if I have more questions.
Okay.
I guess another question too is, sorry, what's that?
Anytime.
Great, thank you, Andy. Will the technical report include on those differences with the local areas, will it include kind of the specifics of how the data was derived for a specific municipality so that municipalities and others who are working at a local scale can kind of evaluate that fine-grained detail, or is that going to be too much? Do you know that yet?
I think we're still working through exactly how it's going to be presented, but our hope is, I mean, we obviously want to tell people how the data layers were created, right? So we just need to, I think, work through the details and make sure that it's clear and that people can understand it. And so the answer would be yes. That's our hope, that people will be able to go to the technical report and understand how those data were derived so that they can apply them appropriately. So James, I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'm just anticipating doing that, and then like it's not like it's a municipal specific application for every single town. That we're doing let's take the local landscapes as an example again. So like you have the statewide IEI, everything is from 0 to 1 and it's kind of scaled statewide or by ecoregion. So then you do kind of that same thing and you make everything go between 0 and 1 for every single town. So if something was done for every single town, it makes it a unique product that you're applying to the town. Then all we did was go in and say, let's find all the areas that are 0.8 and higher. And then you say, let's coalesce those areas and find those areas that are 10 acres or more. And then you make a buffer off of those things. So that's really it. It's like, we didn't do anything specific to Lincoln, like in order to make the local landscape scale, the local landscape layer for Lincoln. We did the same thing for every single one of the towns, but the result is that it's hopefully going to be a more useful layer at the municipal level. So does that make sense? Like if you're looking for, in Lincoln, like it's this habitat at this point, like in this particular part in the town, and we know because of a field survey that like a salamander is located there. It's definitely not that type of local analysis. However, with the heritage data, we're definitely turning on additional heritage species observations at the local level. So in that way, it's certainly like town-specific information. If you then jump to the wetland cores at the local level, it's more similar to what we did with local landscapes. We rescaled the data for within the towns. And then once again, we're picking kind of the top tier of the wetlands. So we'll have all that information for sure in the technical document. And with the exception of the species of conservation concern, it's really an analysis that we can systematically apply to every town, just with consistent thresholds.
Abby,
That's helpful. Sorry,
the
go ahead.
piece of your, just sorry, real quick, the piece of your question about understanding what's in your town, we're going to try to take advantage of the latest technology in the interactive map that gives you a very detailed return for your town, so that you can get a really in detailed understanding of what components are in your town, how big they are, what areas they cover, why they cover those. So we're trying to take advantage of the mapping tools to give a really clear return for users at that municipal level.
That makes sense. That was really helpful, James, when you were originally talking about the difference in the localities. My understanding was that the scaling would actually change town to town, but I think that really helped me understand the way that that's going to work. And it seems like it'll be applicable across communities. So,
Okay. Great.
Thank you.
I wonder if we should ask some questions of the audience. Okay, there's some more coming in, but before folks have to take off, it'd be great to get some quick feedback.
Do you want to take this question in the chat, Andy, or first, or do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, let's see.
Okay, so the question is, wondering how the data being used for biomaps being coordinated with the data being generated for RMAT standards, as well as the EEA for precipitation drought management.
I'm
Yeah.
actually not familiar with those data sets. James?
Well, I'm not familiar with those data sets either, but I think the example that's closest to beginning to take into account that type of data is in the aquatic core. We attempted to begin to layer on those pieces of information that are going to become increasingly available over the next years, such as the USGS temperature prediction data, where they were trying to predict the temperatures of the aquatic systems under several of the future climate emission scenarios. And so we looked at the predictions for all the different streams in the state, and the thing that we were looking for was the most stable stream systems, like those streams that are predicted to have the least change in their temperatures, and so that they're the most stable and likely going to be the most resilient, so that we can overlay that resiliency concept on top of the areas that we're already picking. We did that in the aquatic core with the USGS data set. The resiliency data that's coming from the Nature Conservancy, it's built a little bit different, but again, we're trying to find the areas where the landscape itself is more resilient and is going to allow a place for species to move either up gradient, down gradient, or north south. So we're applying that concept again. I think these types of data layers are going to become more and more and more common. And like Eve said, that's one of the reasons that BioMap needs to kind of shift into more of a dynamic living format, because once you start really identifying these refugia or these areas that are more resilient in the landscape, our priorities may actually have to shift, and we may actually have to move to different areas if those are the places that are becoming more stable for species. So we're trying to incorporate some of those things already. I think it's going to become more commonplace in the future.
Yeah, and I'll just say that we've started having those conversations internally already. We're heavily involved as an agency at these EEA level efforts that were mentioned. And so this really is to kind of set the base, right? Get all this information together, start incorporating some of this information. And then I think the key term here is overlay, right? So as new data come in and become available, being able to use those data and overlay them on what we've developed here and see how that might inform, or as James said, shift some of the priorities. So it's an ongoing process, and it will be because we're constantly getting new information.
Yeah, and like the last summer actually gives a really good example. Some of the fish biologists actually bought some new equipment that's going to allow them to go and try to find the thermal refugia in a lot of different streams in the state. But as you guys know, it was really it was rainy last year and really flashy, and there was so much water moving through the systems that they couldn't really find the thermal refugia because it was a different type of summer. And so things are changing, and we're attempting to identify those things, those areas, but it's going to take some time.
Okay, so if there aren't any, I can't see the chat so right now because I'm sharing a screen. So if there are any other questions, or maybe we can move on to one or two questions that we have, because we really wanted to get some feedback because we're knee deep in finalizing BioMap right now. So I'm going to, I think, just move ahead, Andy, if that's okay with you, to this question. So I think we wanted people to maybe raise their hands, right? Hopefully this can be a little bit more of an interactive discussion. We'd like to just understand how people have been using BioMap3. Don't be shy. Hopefully people have been using it.
Yeah, we have been using it a lot. I mean, I know Andy, you've been working with our land protection and staff and Dan to do some regional prioritization, but for stewardship, when we're working with some of our other communities in our region at Sudbury Valley Trustees, we actually have created some map packets for some of the towns to try to help them with their local priorities for both stewardship, well, in my case, for stewardship actions. And so that's why I was particularly interested in what's going into those local town layers. And also I use it a lot to prioritize my own stewardship work. And obviously for funding, you know, just to say, why is this so important? Why do we need the money at this location to do this work? So those are the ways that I've been using it.
Rita, you had I'm sorry to interrupt, go ahead.
No, I just said great, that's all.
Okay, Rita had her hand up next.
Yes, as a small all-volunteer land trust that just focuses in one community, Boxborough, then BioMap has been great for us educating and engaging the public on the value of these spaces. It was very useful to us as we were pursued and were awarded a conservation partnership grant, and that land is conserved. And I'm also looking to, although I don't think the new one will be available in time to meet our deadline, our open space and recreation plan has to be updated as soon as possible. And I want to make everyone aware BioMap. So very, very, very useful. So for planning, and then I think we're going to use it as we move forward with our stewardship plans for our properties.
In the chat, we have Sheffield Land Trust saying we use it in supporting grant and fundraising efforts and in helping to guide conservation. Someone else had asked, just so everybody is aware of this, somebody had asked, Ann had asked, will this info be incorporated into Mass Mapper? And James responded, yes, we anticipate that users will be able to load the BioMap layers in Mass Mapper. In addition, you'll have the BioMap2 or BioMap3 interactive map tool that give you some additional functionality.
So I'm going to move on to the next question that we had. Andy, do you want to take this one or?
Sure. So, yeah, we've got this as two parts. You answer either. What tools that were created for BioMap2 are most useful? What do you use? What resources? The interactive map, our glossy document, the technical report, and or which components do you use? Do you use at the core scale, the core habitat and critical natural landscape, or do you dive down into some of the components like forest core, the species data. Interactive map.
Yeah, maybe Laura's saying that. If anybody wants to speak up, just raise your hand.
At DCR, we kind of, oh, I didn't raise my hand.
Go ahead, Jen.
Jen Soper.
Hi, thank you. We approach it differently. Well, there are 4 of us that are doing land protection right now, and we look macro and micro. We look at the overall, the core habitat and critical natural landscape, and then we sort of try to drill down into that data and find out, why does it qualify for these descriptions? Why do they fall under these categories? And that helps inform us as to how special and important and critical that particular parcel could be if we were able to add that into an adjacent, ideally, state park, so state forest. That's how we use it. We use it to bolster our argument for why we want to buy this parcel. Well, because it has all these amazing natural resource values.
I would say at Greenbelt, we use the downloadable data the most. We use all the components as well as the core and critical natural landscape. Like Leah was saying, kind of when we're at the project level is often when we're diving into those components. Although sometimes in analyses, we have pulled those, the pieces out and use them as needed. Although we do have the map up on our wall. So we do use the
We have the different versions. And I'm waiting for my signed one of BioMap3. We're going to all decide to call it.
Sheffield Land Trust in the chat says we're using everything, glossy document and interactive map most. And yes, the components in core habitat and critical natural landscapes.
Great.
We have a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you want to wait to take more questions till your questions are done, or?
Yeah, why don't we tackle Lee's question after we finish going through these questions?
Okay, so I think this is the last one that we had, was that if there was one thing you could change or add to what you know of BioMap2, so what you've been working with, what would it be? Knowing that, we've made some obvious enhancements and changes, but is there anything that you would like to see?
Oh.
And actually, this question, we'd be happy to take, if you take more time and thought of something, please reach out and send an email or something to that effect. But, even right now, if anything off the top of people's heads would be greatly appreciated.
Pallavi, she has her hand up. Go ahead. I've asked you to unmute.
Thank you. Thanks, Abby. I was wondering if you all think it's worth kind of making this database available to Conservation Commission for each of those towns. I just like the question about the open space plan, I think that's really a great application for this data at a municipal level, but wondering if it influences, the regulatory areas, and especially with, climate change factors being incorporated. Just wondering, how difficult or how tricky or easy that might be to incorporate as a feature.
I want to make sure I understand. So the data will be available to anybody when they, when it's, I'll use the term published, right, online. And yep. So they'll be able to access it and use all the tools, as well as download it if they have other GIS capabilities. So are you suggesting, I guess I want to understand your question a little bit more, sorry.
Sorry about that. Let me just give an example, say. So if we are at a town-wide level, first doing an open space plan and then kind of also thinking about, how resource areas might change in terms of the delineation based on climate data. So I'm just wondering how this data set might interact with that or inform that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think I understand what you're asking. I think there'll be utility in municipalities and conservation commissions looking at the data to identify priority resources, whether it's a wetland area, a rare species habitat, what we're calling local landscapes. It's not necessarily going to be at the fine scale that you might need for like delineation or something to that effect. But what it can do is, I think, point people in the right direction as to areas that are identified as priorities for whatever, resource it is, whether it's rare species or a wetland core area. So we're hopeful that it will help streamline and focus conservation efforts in that way.
That's helpful. Thank you.
So Lee has a comment that I think is in response to this question. It is following on from Jen's comment. NHESP often allows you to drill down to understand why an area is mapped, i.e. species involved. I don't believe BioMap currently does that. It would be great if that was more possible.
So I'll take this one. So we need to walk the fine line of providing information, but being protective of rare species locational information. So we're actually in the midst of this discussion right now. I think that it's still going to be at the town level, the information, because we have on our website right now a town species viewer where you can go and zoom to a town and get a list of all the species that are within the boundaries of the municipality. We purposefully, though, don't go down to a lower scale than that because we need to be protective of exactly where these species are. So the information that will be provided in BioMap will be similar to what you've seen in the sense of it identifies areas, but it's not going to necessarily tie it to a specific species. But then through your town viewer, you should be able to also get a sense of what species you have within the boundaries of the municipality. That being said, there is also the ability for conservation organizations to reach out to us. I'll use the term offline through a process to identify species for their properties so that they can use it for conservation effort planning. But we definitely need to be very careful as to how specific we are with the data that are put out electronically like that.
We have another comment from Sheffield Land Trust. I would build on the comment about utility for local communities in saying that having a series of maps that could hang on the wall for each municipality or live in a file would be helpful, since there are many municipalities where the volunteer boards don't use GIS, and being able to pull out a map and point to it in discussions or in planning can make a huge difference. The same can be said about many land trusts.
That's a great comment. I think that's important for us to recognize as we move more and more into sort of a digital space. I myself like paper still and like pulling out maps and things like that. So that's something we'll take back for consideration. It could possibly be that we have the ability to create, PDF maps or something like that that people could then potentially print. Oftentimes it's a scale issue. If you make a map of it that's on a normal, 8.5 by 11, you can't see anything because it's just too much in a small space. So you need something that's printed down on like a plotter, like a bigger printer. But it's something that we do for our regulatory maps. So maybe it's something we can consider for some of BioMap. So we'll definitely take that comment back. That's very helpful. Thank you.
And another one here. Sadly, MNHESP will not divulge where the tactile are. I'm still looking.
Those are highly protected, Jen, you know that. So I don't see any other questions. And that was the last question I think we had. And it's been really great getting this feedback and this discussion. Andy, I don't know, or James, if there's anything else you want to add.
No, just to thank people for that input and for sticking with it. It was a great discussion.
We did have an earlier question, if we have time to take that, if that's okay.
Sure.
Unless this was answered already, but I think it was from Lee, and it says mass climate action tool includes an info clearinghouse and perhaps resilient mass and MVP transferable tools too. Do you see BM3 having a clearinghouse niche in this suite?
Good question, Lee. It's a matter of all the tools and how do we pull them all together and so forth. I think it's worth discussing. You know, BioMap is going to take the form of a GIS hub and link out to different things as well. So there will be opportunity to have all of those tools linked together. And then I know the effort that you've been working on will also be able to help, I think, manage that. So if I'm understanding your question correctly.
Okay.
Well, I'll just say, you know, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And, you know, hopefully it came across that we're really excited about this. We're maybe a little bit drained just because it's, you know, the end spurt for us and sprint. We're very much looking forward to rolling this out, working really, really hard to get all the pieces and ducks in a row, or you know, landscapes in a row, whatever you want to call it. And so we're very proud of the work, and we're just excited for people to start using it and giving us feedback. And, you know, again, it's sort of a living effort. So, you know, we do anticipate new information coming in all the time, and future enhancements being made more frequently. So